Okay. Right. So Culadasa, last time we left off, we were in 1989, and the 80s were a good decade, if you ask me. But we left off in 1989, and we're going to start with you talking about your stream entry experience. Before we do that, I think it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit from your perspective about the taboo around discussing attainments, why they're there, and also what what's good about them, and what's good about that taboo, what's bad about it, and where you stand on discussing these things openly, and then perhaps just before going into actually talking about your experiences, saying what the any important context that you feel is good to know around that experience and time for you. Yeah.
Yes, well, I think what you've suggested topic is very appropriate. I'm getting a message of internet instability. Is everything all right?
I'm hearing you fine.
Okay, good.
Just carry on. Yeah.
Right. So I'll just carry on. Yeah, I think we need to. It's very appropriate to talk about this very against talking about these things, and I think it's also very. Yeah, there's some other things about this that are very important to discuss first. So, first of all, if we look at the origins of that has become entrenched in a particular form in Buddhist traditions, Buddhist traditions. And if we look at its origin, there's injunction in the Vinaya, the rules are the monks, that what it specifically is speaking of one's attainments to somehow gain anything, whether it's material, respect, admiration, or anything like that. That makes sense. I can't remember the wording of it. It's been a few years since I read it. What sticks with me is that something about the reading suggests to me that the primary intention was not to exaggerate your attainments, but even exaggeration notwithstanding, not to speak of your attainments in an inappropriate way for some kind of self-serving reason. Now, I interpret that to mean that the only reason for ever speaking about your attainments would be for the benefit of others, and the only reason for not doing it would be anything that wasn't for the benefit of somebody else and wasn't well considered and as skillful as possible. That got turned to just, speak about attainments at all, except maybe to your teacher. And sometimes that seems to be loosened up enough so that you might speak about your attainments to your peers, if you're a monastery or something like that. But never to lay people, basically never to anyone else. That has some unfortunate consequences. The one I first became aware of, like everybody else, I was looking for guidance, looking for teachers, looking for somebody with more knowledge and experience than myself. And from being next to nobody to being all kinds of people emerging. With the Tibetan diaspora, there were all kinds of Tibetan teachers of their own. As more and more American teachers were first those that were trained in Southeast Asia, and then brought that version of the Dharma and practice back. And then there was a second generation teachers that were trained by those that went to Southeast Asia and came back and studied institutions here. And as the number of teachers multiplied, and not all of these teachers were associated with an actual tradition. That's the other thing. There were teachers emerging who weren't part of an established lineage and tradition. So from the time I first started practicing Buddhism in the 70s through till today, as I think you've been involved long enough to see, the number of teachers and those who express expertise and things like that has mushroomed significantly. Now, one of the things that would be enormous, would have been for me for a very was to have knowledgeable people who really did have attainments speak more openly about them. The other thing that I discovered, and I really became aware of this first, and it seemed to be a real flaw in the not saying about attainments doctrine, is that there were all these teachers. It's like, students want to know what their level of attainment is, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Wink, wink. Right. So, and then later, now again, we have people that, they just come right out and say, I'm an arhat, I'm this, I'm that, and everything. And once again, in the absence of a long-standing tradition of people speaking about what this is like, you look at these different people and their claims, and it's like, what? Why isn't there some consistency across this? Why are these different weird ideas here coming up? Who can you believe and who can't you? So we come back to this thing of it would be very valuable for people to speak about their attainments so that sincere aspirants had a clearer idea of where they were going and how they could tell whether they were going in the right direction or not. But in the absence of that as a long-standing tradition, we had all kinds of people just standing up and making claims, which makes things worse, not better. So this is an unfortunate situation. Now, the other thing that's happened is that people take the Buddha's teaching, they take the Dharma, they take the doctrines of the various Buddhist schools that have been developed and sustained over a long period of time, and they make them into the same sort of conceptual frameworks. They make first path, second path, third path, fourth path into things, which even the barest insight makes a person realize these have to be arbitrary landmarks that are chosen. These are not things. Somebody isn't an arhat. Somebody isn't a stream enterer. Somebody has progressed as a part of a complex developmental process to a point where it becomes useful to identify a developmental stage. But it's not a thing. It's not a stable state. It's just the evolution of the process. And the difference, making those landmarks correspond to, different bhumis or to different paths or things like this. These are at best arbitrary and chosen because of their practical utility. Kind of like the 10 stages that I described in TMI, or the 9 stages that Asanga described. It's their practical utility for the guidance of the student that makes these worthwhile. Making them into things, making them into attainments, make them into badges of accomplishment really is not consistent with the reason that these were originally articulated. Now back to my own situation and why I would be willing to speak about this. Prior to a morning in 1989, I had had several experiences which, based on the information available to me and my conceptualization and intellectual understanding of these things, and my emotional reaction to a strong experience, I had mistakenly thought were something that they weren't. And the interesting thing is that with each of those occasions that weren't stream entry, I felt a strong inner conviction, a belief that they were, based on the mental constructs that I had developed around stream entry and based on the subjective impact of the realization of the shift in my perception that had occurred. What I hadn't done with this is been able to draw a really strong and deeply meaningful correlation between the experience and what had given rise to it, articulated in the form of insights and articulated in form of fetters that fall away. It was a much looser kind of conceptual framework. Now, so I had that kind of certainty one morning in 1989, but I'd had that kind of certainty before. The difference was that from this new perspective, well, the most important things is, number one, it was like, wow, this is so simple and so obvious. How could I have missed this before? And then the realization, well, that's why I missed it before. It was so simple and so obvious. And the other thing was, this is something you can only have a rough approximation of intellectually and conceptually. It is only when it occurs experientially that it has a different quality to it. It produces a lasting, a persistent and consistent lasting change in perception. So these were things that made me feel just more confident about this. Because one of the things that I had heard and read people say is that one of the experiences of true insight, path attainment, is it was something that was so obvious that once you understood it, that it was, in a sense, but not really, difficult to understand why you didn't see this before or why everyone else didn't see it. I mean, it seems that simple, but at the same time, you also know exactly why you didn't, because of the other ideas, the obscurations that your mind was full of that prevented you from seeing it. That we're trying to take reality and fit it into a box, into a model, into a conceptual framework. So these were important differences in that. The other thing was the persistence and the consistency of the perceptual shift that took place afterwards. This was not something transient. It's something that ebbed and flowed, but it was a permanent shift in perception in a very real and tangible way. It also allowed me to put my previous experiences into perspective, which was okay experience, in which there was a certain degree of insight achieved and a certain degree of change in perspective that took place, but it was immature. And each subsequent experience contributed more to its maturation. I also, from the perspective of this experience, could see that an important part of that maturation is to take different aspects of insight that have been subdivided into anatta and suffering, emptiness, uh, codependent co-origination, uh, anatta, impermanence, that part of that maturation was the coming together of these, the gelling into a cohesive, unified whole. Whereas my previous experiences have been much more emphasized one or another of these, and to a much lesser degree, the others. Then the final thing is I had a clarity, and I didn't have a need to bypass this. I had the clarity to say to myself, well, I've thought this was something that I had experienced before, but I can see clearly that I hadn't. This is different. So I'm not going to make any big assumptions about this. I may, at some future point, realize, no, not that either. These were the important differences, though. Now, years later, when I had what I've now come to refer to as second path experience, which did occur in deep retreat, not in my morning meditation. From that perspective, there came the certainty that, yes, that was stream entry. I mean, that had been a growing certainty for years, but in actually realizing what I believed at that point to be second path and subsequently became confirmed in, from that perspective, then there was a complete certainty of what I had thought was first path. That yes, that was first path. In a sense, the only way that I now would say a person could feel confident at any particular path attainment is having lived on that path long enough to have arrived either at the next path or just be on the verge of it, to be able to look back and validate and verify. So from that, I have a set of criteria. People are going to be, to a greater or lesser degree, the way that I was, and that they're going to have experiences. They're very likely to have experiences that are true revelations, true attainments of wisdom, but they don't achieve that sort of milestone standard that's defined as a path or as a bhumi. And with the path model, we have specific fetters that the Buddha mentions to provide guidance. Qualitatively, the persistence, well, the clarity, the simplicity, the aha, that, and then the persistence and consistency of the change in perception, and then the further maturation of that increases the certainty. So with all of these, if I can share my experience, then by sharing my experience, I can help people not to believe that something is something that it's not. I can help them to understand better how to evaluate their developing wisdom. Most importantly of all, by sharing my experience and my perception of this, to which I can now add my experience guiding other people. So I'm not just giving the perspective of one person. I mean, everything that I've learned has to be grounded in my own individual experience. But having worked with enough other people now on these paths, I now have the benefit of these other perspectives that I could never have. I can't go back and make the same journey over again in a different way. By sharing that, I can help people to not get basically help people to understand more clearly what the path is about. Stay on the path, not spend as much time as I did in dead ends and wrong, misunderstandings and misattributions and things like that. If I can streamline people's understanding of the path in such a way that two goals: to keep them from imagining that they and on the other way, make it very clear what and how attainments are, what is genuinely attainment, an ignorant way of confabulating an attainment for whatever reason out of things that aren't. So I've come to the conclusion the best thing I do is to share my own experience.
Culadasa, I lost you there for a second.
Yeah, I think I know where I said that to drop the labels. Did you get that?
Let me just make sure that. Would you just mind if I'm going to restart my computer? I'm so sorry because this is important stuff, and I feel really bad that my connection is causing this. But let me restart my computer and see if that helps, and then we'll maybe backtrack a sentence or two. Is that all right?
Yes.
Thanks. Right. If can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Lovely. So if we could just backtrack a little bit, you said that there were two things that you felt were really important that you wanted to share with people, or that you were hoping that you think are important around this. Do you remember?
I'm not sure what I was referring to as the two things.
Okay, well,
more than two things.
I'm so sorry about that. So I think, well, just carry on wherever your thoughts are at the moment, and it'll come back, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, I think where I was when the interruption occurred was, I feel like what I can do that would be of the greatest value to other people is to share my experience as my experience. And I would include in that what I've learned from guiding other people.
Yes.
That's still part of my experience. But share my experience as my experience to make reference to what the Buddha actually said in his attempts to provide guidance, but to try to find a way to avoid or at least minimize the tendency to labels, okay, and to turn aspects of process into things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'll try to do. Now, I have, up till now, been pretty reluctant to say anything too specific about my own experience in terms of attainments. But I've decided that this is something that is very important and valuable for me to do. So I'm going to do this. I've made up my mind. And this is the beginning of it, so to speak. So yeah, let me just go ahead and begin. Let's go to the morning in '89. Well, I was doing early morning meditations while members of my family were asleep. And I had a profound meditation experience. It didn't involve the sort of gap in consciousness that at that point a lot of people were, based on Mahasi and based on Mahasi's interpretation of Buddhaghosa and the Visuddhimagga, there had already at that point in time been a lot of popularization of the idea that there was some kind of gap that was associated with path attainment. And I didn't have that experience. I had something that just clearly resonated, different phrasing of this, which is a pure consciousness experience, or consciousness without an object. So rather than a gap in consciousness. I've subsequently come to attribute that to kind of practice that I was doing at the time, which was more along the lines of what I described in TMI as meditation on the mind. It was also a very metacognitive state. So in some ways, it also resembled that highest of metacognitive perspectives that corresponds to the still point. From that perspective, an interruption in the content of consciousness wasn't something that would be the only thing that registered in my mind. Rather, it was this registration of being conscious, but there being no object of consciousness, which is not an accurate description, but it's more a description of a feeling of the experience. So consciousness without an object, or conversely, another way of saying the same thing, is a pure consciousness experience. All there is consciousness, no object. But now I attribute it to the fact that I was in this very highly metacognitive perspective. So that there was consciousness, and that consciousness had no object, was what registered in my brain mind and became the memory that was immediately available to me after the experience. So, as I say, the feeling was of enormous clarity, of the absolute simplicity, of the obviousness, of how easy it was to grasp these truths, and almost, but not quite, I wonder about why this wasn't obvious to me before. I also knew why it wasn't, but it seemed like it shouldn't have been, right? What did I subjectively experience? I subjectively experienced myself as a process, not a self, as something that was part of a whole. I had a whole new way of seeing and understanding things. From this perspective of being a process that was merely one aspect of a much greater process, then all ideas that there was something magical or something outside of the realm of this wholeness that would transform me from being an ordinary person to being somebody with wisdom seemed laughably ridiculous, right? And just the simple obviousness of the truths that I experienced wiped out any sense of any kind of doubt. In terms of the three fetters, the notion of self, the concept of self, this experience of an ego self, this deep-seated sense of being a self, was so obviously inappropriate. Easy to see why I would have always felt this way, thought this way, believed this. But also, even more obviously, why that really isn't appropriate. That's not true. There is no magic. This is the intended evolution of every aspect of this whole process that the so-called I was a part of. And that yeah, there was no room for doubt. It was just, wow, you know, it's like hitting your thumb with a hammer. There can be no doubt about it. I mean, maybe that's not the best analogy, but the thing about it, it's abrupt and it's totally unmistakable.
Now, just as a little interjection there, you have said in the past, so that not everybody has this as a self-contained experience happening in a small period of time, like a one moment thing. Some people it takes hours, days, or even weeks.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, on the one hand, I had a clearly identifiable experience demarcated a shift. What I came and this coincided with what what I later realized is this was not really something that was being described in the suttas. This was something that came later, but it became very firmly entrenched. And you know, I've thought a lot about why that is, and basically came to the conclusion that when the shift occurs as a part of an intentional practice, it's more likely to take this form. But I've since come across people that I have no doubt have attained to first or second or higher paths who cannot identify a particular event, a particular, even the time frame is vague. You know, I'd say the shortest time frame I've encountered is one woman who described to me. She woke up one morning, and it gradually dawned on her as the morning went on that she was seeing things very differently than she had before. But you know, she couldn't say, did this, is this something that happened while I was asleep last night? When did this happen? How did this happen? Because even in the course of the day, it was a gradual realization that gradually extended to more and more. You know, she gave an elegant description of what it was like for her. And then the realization that something really important had happened. Now, that's the closest to a short to to just an experience of a gap or of a pure consciousness experience or something like that that I would put in this category. And then there's others who say that it was so gradual. All they can say is, as for example, one person, Chinese man, said, well, it was over the summer of 2010. That's all I can say. That somehow or another, and it was like just a gradual awakening, bit by bit, or even a gradual realization that I was awakened, but not fully realizing that at any one particular time. So since then, since then I've come to realize that, and I've gone back and looked at the suttas, and you know, the descriptions of the suttas that correspond to people achieving awakening. This list to a Dharma talk while fanning the Buddha. So there's no mention of having a particular experience, or a sharply demarcated experience. There are other accounts which suggest that this happening more gradually was not unusual, and you know, with reference to the suttas. There are other occasions where it seems like it was more a singular occasion. Like, for example, one of the 5 companions of the Buddha that he spoke to Sariputta, and he said to Sariputta, Sariputta asked him, well, first I'll give you a little background. Sariputta and Moggallana had grown up together. They'd entered into spiritual practice with different teachers together, and they were followers of one teacher at this time. They were separated from each other, but they had made this pledge that if either one of them, experienced awakening, enlightenment, that they would immediately let the other one know. What their teacher was that typically Vedic practice of trying to get in touch with the true self, the real self, something which we find now in modern Vedanta, and with the advent of Advaita Vedanta, it became more consistent with what the Buddha taught, where rather than, well, I won't go into the difference in that right now. Anyway, so Sariputta had this history of searching for the real self, the true self, for many years. And when he was approached, when he saw one of the first people that the Buddha taught, and he noticed something unusual about them, he said, who is your teacher and what does he teach? And he was told, my teacher teaches the arising and passing away of things due to causes and conditions. This was the trigger, and it's described as Sariputta experienced the opening of the eye of the Dharma. Now that sounds like an abrupt experience, right?
Yeah.
All right, that sounds like something that corresponds to a gap in consciousness or a pure consciousness experience. Well, he went off and he found Moggallana, and he told Moggallana the whole story of what had happened, and Moggallana, with a similar background to Sariputta, had the same experience as a result of hearing the story, the opening of the eye of the Dharma. Right? And this is something that's referred to in other places in the suttas. So I came to the conclusion that, yes, this did happen as a singular, abrupt event in the time of the Buddha, but it also happened quite frequently as something more gradual, whether it was over the course of hours, maybe listening to the Buddha speaking while fanning him, or even longer periods of time. And what I've encountered with different people has reinforced that.
Right. So I do want to ask on that point, and sorry, we're stepping out of the story for a moment, but I think there's so much important context around everything you're discussing. The first thing I in your theta model seems completely inappropriate, because it always seems to be about things falling away. It's not about attaining anything. It's a letting go. And who would wear a badge of honor necessarily of something that you haven't achieved, right? It's not about achieving anything. So I'm not as familiar with the Bhumi model, but this is essentially about ideas that one has in one's mind falling away and being seen through, not about attaining something new.
Yes, that's
right. Yeah. So there's that. And then the other thing is, there've been so many, over the years, I've read so many accounts of people, particularly in the pragmatic Dharma community, that I read them and it does sound a lot like what you described a little earlier, where you said, well, I had all these experiences and which I mistook for path shifts. Let's call them, I prefer that to, let's say, attainments, right? Path shifts that had taken place. And they were absolutely convinced, but, it happened 2 days ago, and they would then share, their accounts, and they're absolutely convinced. And what I am concerned about this, and this brings us back to talking openly about these things, is that does create scripts and models for people who don't know any better at this stage, who can't discern the difference, the difference, and could possibly be very misleading. If you could just perhaps talk a little bit about this and how best to avoid that, because on the one hand you're saying, look, it's really helpful, students need to know a bit more about what to expect or what to look for, but on the other hand, by being too open or just simply declaring these things, we are quite often deluding ourselves and possibly misleading others.
Yes. Yes. Well, the thing is that it's better to say nothing at all unless you're willing to speak enough truth and openly um, to truly convey your experience. That's the best way to have someone else be able to point out to you that maybe it isn't what you thought it was. It's also the best way for other people to understand the difference between those things that are necessary parts of getting there but aren't the arrival,
Yeah.
so-called attainment that you think they are. It involves approaching this with a degree of clarity and honesty. And anybody who's dedicated their lives to this path has a lot at stake. They really, if for no other reason than that they've invested the time and energy and they have this aspiration, they have whatever beliefs and ideas of what this will mean, what it will be like. It's something that they've aspired to with so much energy that it's easy to fool yourself. You're looking for the cities of gold. So you see a shimmer on the buildings in the distance and you're sure that it's that's it. You've arrived, you found. And that's understandable. There's nothing wrong with that. And the thing that gives rise to that is valid and important in itself. It's not to be discounted. But if you think you've arrived and you haven't, it's going to slow you down. And if you announce to everybody else that this is what it's like, but it's not what it's like, then you're going to invite other people to waste their time as well.
Yeah. I think in the past, sorry, I interrupted there. I apologize.
Well, I'll just add, my big beef with the pragmatic Dharma movement is, I was really behind it in the beginning when it seemed to be saying, when pragmatic was taken to mean, whatever works, use it. But then when I realized it had become a process of redefining all of these really important Dharma concepts to make them more easily accessible, so let's redefine stream entry to be something that's much easier to attain. That doesn't serve anybody's purpose. I mean, granted, imagining that stream entry is this incredible thing that's almost impossible to attain, things like that, is not terribly helpful either, because it can lead to being discouraged. It can allow you to practice inappropriately, and then just attribute that your failure to succeed to the fact that, well, this is such a difficult thing to attain. Now, those are things that's something that the pragmatic Dharma approach should get rid of. It's like, let's be practical about this. If there's any point in this practice, then these things should be attainable, but then it should be countered with, but we're not going to redefine the goal in order to make it more attainable. We're going to find better ways to attain the goal. We're going to find more effective approaches.
I think over the years, one thing that I've heard you say more than once or implied is that if you feel that you've had this path shift, this life-changing experience, before running out and proclaiming it, the best thing to do is live with it for a while, and see, as you said, what effect is it having? Is this a persistent thing that's happening to you? And I know that traditionally, at least in Zen traditions, and I think some of the Theravadin traditions as well, there is this expectation that you would have these things verified by someone who is more experienced than you are. That this is something that you would go to a teacher with, and the teacher would help you make sense of what's happened.
Yes, that is very true. You'd go to a teacher who would help you make sense of what had happened. The other thing at least what I was taught was that a good teacher, if the teacher and the student both think you may have attained, say, stream entry or some particular path, and once again we're slipping into using the word attain, but anyway, if you believe that that's what's happened, a good teacher would say, well, in 6 months to 2 years, we'll know for sure.
We'll know for sure. Come back and report back. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that does seem to be the safest thing, because I see people all the time making these proclamations, and it's like, well, this happened last night, and it's 5 hours later, and you are, saying this. And there have been, to their credit, there have been 1 or 2 people that come back and say, listen, I was mistaken there. But generally, as you say, people have invested a lot of their time and often their identity into their meditative and spiritual journey, and it's very difficult to take that back, as it were.
Yes, that's right. It is. And there's a reluctance to take it back, even when it becomes really obvious that it. Well, I'll tell you the story. I had one young man who came to do a solo retreat, and in my initial interview with him, he told me how many years he'd been practicing and who he'd been practicing with, and he said, I achieved second path 2 years ago, but my life is still full of suffering, and I don't understand why. And, it's like, well, maybe it's because you think you've achieved second path and you're not doing the things you need to reach that place where your suffering is so greatly attenuated.
Yeah. I think that's a really nice example. I have seen people over the years that have said, well, I'm second path or I'm third path. And I look at them and I go, but if that's what it looks like, I'm not particularly interested in that path shift. And I think that they're not able to, perhaps it's because they don't have the kind of feedback that they need around them or whatever. But at the end of the day, you do have the suttas to go back to. You do have the at least the Theta model, which seems to be your favored model, which are quite, I wouldn't say they're very specific or very clear, but they're certainly a useful benchmark, are they not?
Yes, they are. The reason that I like the path and the Fetter model is that what I've discovered is that it's far more precise and clearer than it at first appears. In a sense, you almost have to experience the falling away of the fetter before you really understand just how precise and clear that is as a useful tool. Both to the fetters that fall away, the changes that take place with each quote attainment, each path, actually provide a powerful way of guiding your practice towards the achievement of that falling away of that fetter. But it also gives you, when the fetter has fallen away, it loses any sense of unclarity or fuzziness or imprecision that it seems to have. It becomes, like I say, just so crystal clear and obvious. Why didn't I see that before?
Oh, doesn't that sound exactly like what you said a little earlier? It's like you really only, one of the best ways to know that you've had that first path shift is that you actually shift to the second path and you go, now looking back, I can see that has really happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I experienced this even in TMI, where I was dealing with subtle dullness. And the only way that I really knew that subtle dullness was gone, or that I knew what subtle dullness was after it had gone. I went, that's what it feels like to not be subtle. And before that, I was still trying to put my finger on what is subtle dullness, right? That was that investigation that you point to in the book. So I know that's a very, very small example, but seems to me to be similar to what you're talking about.
Yes, yes. And that's a very good example. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it does sound like you're saying the best thing to do is, well, there's a number of things. Firstly, live with this for a while, several months, even years.
Mm-hmm.
Speak to someone who is more experienced than you. Go back to the suttas, really look at what's going on there, and yeah, that does sound to be a sensible way to do these things, even though in that time period you might feel absolutely certain, because you said you had a number of these things where you're quite certain. What did you do? Did you discuss this with other people, or was this just something that you lived with, as we were talking about now?
Yeah, well, both. It's something I discussed with other people, and that had the value, and things I discussed with my teacher. That had the value of whether it was my peers that hadn't themselves experienced what I mistakenly thought I had, or whether it was a teacher who knew far more about these things than I did, was always to say, "Hey, slow down. Wait a minute.
Great.
Get a hold of yourself."
Yeah.
And but I remember the first of these experiences. It was really quite strong, and I happened to be in the presence of my teacher, and I told him in a state of awe about it, and he laughed at me.
Yeah.
It was perfect. It's like,
yeah,
pop my bubble.
Pop your bubble. But that doesn't, it sounds though to me like you're also saying those earlier experiences, it's not that they lacked any value or that they weren't stepping you closer to the actual stream entry shift. Is that right? They were still,
Yes.
They still did result in some transformation and change in your experience of reality.
That is right. They were real. They were valuable. They were important.
Yeah.
I mean, even that very first time, what I realized, I came to later understand it for what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Very specifically, I had the experience while meditating of what I actually understand now was dozing off. I had dozed off and had this little dream. And in this dream, it was kind of, it's interesting how it goes back to the Vedic. I was like Brahma. I realized, oh, everything that I see as this world is just happening in my mind. My mind is creating this all. I came out of that little doze, and I was just really filled with this idea, and it was so obvious how true it was. And, it was a kind of realization of emptiness of other without the realization of emptiness of self. So I placed myself in, wow, I'm the creator of this whole universe. I had this really solipsistic experience, but it was such a powerful solipsistic experience. And it was valid. I mean, in terms of emptiness, it is, realizing that no one and nothing out there is what I think it is because I've just generated in my mind. Less clear for me was the idea that there is something out there that my mind is trying to represent. Mm-hmm. So I fell into the solipsistic trap of it's just purely my mind making it up. And I think that's why Jody laughed at me when I said this. I think he even laughed at me and said, "Go back to sleep" or something like that. Okay. I can't remember exactly. The main thing I remember is he laughed at me and it popped my bubble, and I started to think about it. But it was a really important realization that I had. Mm-hmm. Really important realization.
Fantastic.
It contributed greatly to my future understanding and progress. But the best thing to have was the bubble popped. The sooner the bubble popped, I didn't waste days or weeks or months thinking that, basically confabulating a view of awakening that was false.
But you and your teacher had a trusting enough relationship that he could do that without it severely bruising you to the point where you would give up or just run off and say, "Well, I don't care what you say. I've had this experience."
Yeah.
But I have heard you say, I can't remember, it was one of your interviews where you said, well, you've had people come up to you and absolutely convinced they've had these path shifts, and that it seemed quite obvious to you that they hadn't, and you were not, you felt you couldn't sort of pop their bubble. Why is that? Is that because of you'd be discouraging them so badly, or?
Well, it was actually because of some unfortunate psychological tendencies that I had for a very long time, that I was really reluctant to pop anybody's bubble. I was really reluctant, even when it was obvious to me. I would try to gently point them in the direction of realizing it, rather than, like, Jody had no hesitation. He just laughed at me and they make some joke about it. It was just like, boom. I had great difficulty doing it. I don't think I'd have that difficulty today. But a combination of conflict avoidance and not being able to separate my own boundaries from somebody else's, and wanting to be encouraging and supportive more than, popping somebody's bubble. It's kind of like,
sometimes that's the compassionate thing to do, right? Is like, that's
right.
That's the real loving thing.
That's right.
To go back to Zen, sometimes to hit them with a stick is the nicest thing you can do for that person. I was reading from Sheng Yen's. He said his master was horrible to him. He made him do all these terrible tasks, and every time he'd given him something to do, he would tell him, you're doing that wrong, and why are you wasting your time with that? Do this instead. And the man was really treated quite poorly, but afterwards he looked back and he said, all these things were done to me out of extreme compassion. But it doesn't mean that it's always a pleasant thing. Like, it's not a nice thing to have this idea that you've attained something and then have it snatched away from you.
Yes, that is right. It's not, and it is more compassion. The thing is, the most compassionate thing is to have the greatest degree of openness and honesty. That's what there should always be between a student and a teacher. And I've seen in my own case, students come to me and they believe that they've had some kind of realization that they haven't. I've tried to very gently discourage them from being too attached and giving them advice about what to do. Instead, what happened is they withdraw. They don't come back to me because they don't like what I was saying. They feel very confident that they had achieved this wonderful thing, they'd attained this wonderful thing, and rather than Yahoo celebrating, patting them on the back, all this other thing, so they didn't come back to me. And the next thing I know, they're presenting themselves as teachers, and they're presenting themselves as teachers who attained, first or second path. And it's like, oh, I really blew that one, didn't I? And by then they're out of my reach, because they don't want to, when they wanted to believe that they had achieved something, and I tried to gently discourage them, they said, well, I'm not going to bother with this guy anymore.
Right.
He can't he's either jealous or he can't admit that.
But perhaps if you had been, are you saying that perhaps if you had been more direct, that it would have led to a much more open conversation about what was really going on, and therefore a better chance that the student would course correct?
Yes, it would. And it also would have been more conducive to the person questioning themselves instead of questioning me.
Lovely.
I mean, somebody feels really good about this. Wonderful. Say, for example, oh, I'm a stream enterer now. My God, I've got it. And, I'm going to pour cold water on their parade, but not drench them with the bucket. So instead of doubting their attainment, which is what I should have been my goal, they doubt me. They doubt me. They withdraw from me. And the next thing I know, they're out there proclaiming to the world that they've achieved something that I knew that they hadn't. And I've had a number of students that that's happened with, and it's really sad. Really regret it.
So it does seem that trusting relationship. I'm just thinking so much about how this mirrors something that happens in therapy, where one confronts a client with something at, once the relationship has gotten to a certain point of trust and honesty and integrity, that you do once in a while, you'll get a client who just doesn't come back, but at least you've planted a very important seed that hopefully later they come to realize. But it's not it requires that trust. It requires that faith between the two people, which is why I think an important thing that I know we've gone a little bit away from your experience, but there's so many important things around this. How does one choose a teacher? How do you find someone that you can trust enough so that when they do say to you, listen, you didn't get it, that they can override your own mistaken judgment?
Yes, that is a challenge, because you see what's operating in the ordinary person living in the world of delusion, driven by desire and aversion, craving in its many forms. And the reasons for aspiring to awakening, enlightenment, wisdom are very many, and a lot of them are not particularly wholesome. So the student, when searching for a teacher, is already coming from an extremely biased place. And the experience of the teacher is an extremely important thing. I mean, in my own experience, I was a much, much better teacher a year ago than I was 10 years ago. When did I first allow myself to, for the first time, put on the mantle of a teacher? I suppose that was probably about 2008 in person. I mean, before that, I taught anonymously via emails on discussion groups, and I published the first 6 stages of TMI on a discussion group. But I wasn't really in the role of a teacher. When I took on the mantle of a teacher finally in 2008, I wasn't really good at it. And I'm sure that I'll be a much better teacher a year or two from now than I am now or that I was last year.
Sure. So even because you did say there were certain personality tendencies you had and ways of dealing with conflict and all of that you've only now recently dealt with. So yeah, we're always becoming, but generally there are so many people out there professing to be teachers with these amazing attainments, and it's a kind of a dizzying choice for students, and they don't know any better. I mean, what do you really know when you start this off? So it does seem like there's peril involved in picking a teacher.
Yes, there is. There is a lot of peril, and one of the having a lot more clarity, having a lot more teachers speak openly and honestly will help a lot. The peril is many forms. But what you really want in a relationship with a teacher, well, of course, what you really want is that they do have the knowledge and experience and understanding that you need in a teacher. And it's hard to tell in the teachers that are out there. How do you tell whether this person knows what they're talking about or they're just off on their own deluded trip? You know, like one of my students who became convinced that they were a stream enterer or once returner and went off to teach. I mean, they're out there teaching right now. There's 2 students I think of in particular. They're out there teaching right now. And their students believe something about them that isn't true. How do you know that? Well, I don't have any easy answers for that. The other thing is that all the misconceptions of what does a stream enterer behave like, look like, act like? What does arhat? What is an arhat? And what does an arhat do and say? And how are they different? And things like that. There's so much misinformation out there. So the aspiring student has these influences, and they don't know who really knows what they're talking about. They may be filled with a lot of mistaken ideas, which reinforce their choice of a wrong teacher or perhaps guide them towards the choice of a right teacher. But once again, how do you know? How do you know how accurate the things you read on Reddit or Dharma Overground or something like that are? It's a really challenging situation. Now, what the best guidance I think I could give to somebody who's aspiring is, do you feel like you can achieve a level of openness and honesty and intimacy of communication from you towards the teacher? And are you equally open to hearing not only positive but negative, real guidance from this person? Also, are you willing to set aside expectations? You may choose somebody as a teacher with one set of beliefs and ideas. As you mature in your understanding, are you willing to change? Are you willing to let the relationship with the teacher change? If the teacher is not willing to let the relationship with them change, are you willing to change teachers?
I think that's such a valuable point, because I've read so many accounts now of different people who are considered highly realized masters, and they typically didn't have just one teacher. They had a teacher, and then once they'd learned what they could from this teacher, they went off and they started searching for the next teacher. And even the Buddha went through a number of different teachers in his journey. So I think that's such an important point, is that this unrestricted adoration of a particular teacher, and not willing to listen to anybody else out of any other tradition, and not willing to change teachers when the time comes, is a really, really important, I would say, giveaway or red flag when I see people have that kind of disciple mentality towards certain teachers.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, you know what? I think we've covered some really important ground around some of the context and some of the pitfalls and benefits of working with teachers and talking about attainments and all that sort of thing. We didn't get much further in the story, but I think what we'll do then next time, if that's all right, because we're running out of our allotted time for this week, but next time we'll sort of go back into story mode and talk a little bit about your life during this period, what was actually going on, and how your spiritual practice was affecting you day to day in your work, relationships, and just your daily experience of life.
Sure, that sounds great.
As I said, was there anything else that you felt? I mean, it does seem to me like there's this idea that for example, Zen teachers they're completely silent on it. The famous story of the teacher hanging off the cliff, and he's caught the branch in his teeth, and a student comes along and asks him what is awakening, and the teacher has this terrible quandary, because he's required to speak truthfully, but on the other hand, it'll cost him his life if he opens his mouth. So that's sort of a metaphorical story, a parable, right? But it does speak to some of the approach that some people have taken, which is just don't talk about it ever under any circumstances, because no matter what you say, it is going to be misleading, because as you've said, awakening is not something that really can be put into conceptual terms or communicated adequately through verbal means.
Yes, right. Yes. Well, that story, that metaphor, the way you told it, I think reveals an important aspect of it that's easily misunderstood. You say the teacher's required to speak. Required by who? Required by what? Required how? I mean, if speaking is going to cause the teacher to fall to his death, then his removal from the world, his ability to teach, well, the thing is, we need to fill this out. Is if he's just hanging by his teeth from a root, then chances are pretty good he's going to end up falling anyway. His jaw's going to get tired, the root's going to break, something, right? So this is quite a dilemma. It's like, can I say something fast enough, powerful enough, meaningful enough to justify falling to my death immediately, versus if I hang on a few more minutes, maybe somebody will come along and help me off this cliff face, or I don't know. It's just, it opens up this whole world of possibility. You can't know. You can't predict the future. Well, although this is something that got introduced into the idea of awakened beings, is that somehow they're omniscient.
Right.
Which, from the Dharma perspective, is a nonsensical idea anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if somebody's omniscient, then they could make the right prediction and they know whether to say something or not. Mm-hmm. But is that realistic? Or, what does somebody do in this case? Well, I don't know. What they're going to do is going to depend on all of their own conditioning.
Well, what I'm getting at here is that the choice that some traditions have made on just being completely silent on this issue, in your opinion, it sounds to me like you're saying that that's not necessarily the best thing to do.
That's right.
That actually creates this mystique around things, which can actually lead to more trouble.
Exactly. Yeah, my feeling is you should speak as honestly as possible, and while speaking, say, and everything I say, you're going to misinterpret and misunderstand. So you better understand that now, that whatever you think you heard me saying, just you hold that very lightly, because what you're going to discover is you misunderstood most of what I'm saying. Anyway, I'm going to speak. I'm going to give you the benefit. I'm going to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And just because I love that story, and that you just reminded me that there are so many things about the Zen story there. And one is, if your master's hanging off the edge of a cliff and he's about to die, don't stand there talking about enlightenment. Get a rope.
That's right.
There are certain practicalities that one needs to look at. And I see this a lot with students, is that they're trying to figure out awakening and whatever, but they're not taking care of daily business, like paying the bills, or dealing with illnesses or whatever. So have the right priorities as well. It's such a delicate balancing act, because we get so caught up in this idea of awakening and the apparent life-changing effect that it could have for us. But I think the one thing that seems to keep coming up is that people are expecting something from it that it isn't.
Yes, that is a huge problem. They're expecting something from it that it isn't. And they put so many projections onto it.
Yeah, and I think that is one thing that, once we've gone through your whole biography there, that we will go back to that. And I know you're writing about this, but I think it would be worth time to spend some time on just talking about what it is, what it isn't, what it can do, what it can't do, as far as words are able to express those things.
Yes, absolutely. That's something that in the time I have left, I want to share my whole experience as fully as possible. Yeah. In terms of those stories, there's a similar story about a Buddha that's hanging, I guess, by a root or vine from a cliff, and he notices this luscious strawberry on the cliff next to him. So while hanging there, and the root or whatever it is gradually tearing or breaking, he just reaches out, plucks the strawberry, and eats it. To me, that's a much better expression of enlightened behavior than that of a Buddha hanging by his teeth, trying to figure out whether to speak or not.
Right. Yeah, and that is then the other point that I think people have. I mean, it's a sort of a famous quote by now, where they say there's no enlightened being, there's only enlightened behavior. So
Yeah.
one of the best things I would say in choosing a teacher would be to look at the kind of person that your teacher is and see whether they are living a life that you find exemplary and would want to emulate.
Well, can we modify that?
Sure.
Living a life you find exemplary. Well, what you're doing is you're invoking all of your biases and conditioning, all the things that you were taught when you were 5 or 6 years old in Sunday school and Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts and all this. I don't think that's a very good criteria. Mm-hmm. Deep in your heart, what do you really want to be in terms of your relationship to the world? Does this person live in relationship to the world in a way that you would aspire to? Yeah. Forget all this superficial stuff.
Yeah.
Because you don't know. Just because you were taught when you were young and impressionable, and people that you had a lot of respect for told you certain things, and that creates your model of an exemplary life. I mean, what is that really worth?
Mm-hmm. I think you're quite right. I used the wrong word there, and that shows how tricky these issues can be. What I meant is that someone you would like to be like?
Yes.
At the end of the day.
Is that someone you'd like to be like?
Yeah, and let's take the famous Chogyam Trungpa. I mean, he was drinking and womanizing, and like you just looked at him and you said, "Well, is this really someone I would want to be like?" And to me, that the answer there was quite clearly no.
Right.
So although he might have been saying very wise things and been teaching amazing Dharma, but that was not who I would want to be like, right? So exactly. I think that's part of choosing. But the other thing is, as we've said, we've talked about so many, but the other thing is also willingness to learn from different sources, not just to say, well, this is my teacher, this is the lineage, and that's it. I'm not worth, it's not worth listening to anybody else.
Right, exactly.
Lovely. I think we've covered some really important things today. I hope you agree. And so next time we meet, we'll go back into the story and see if we can get into the 90s.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good. Sounds great.
Fantastic.
I like it.
All right. Till next time. I'll just pause the recording here.